Chris Bache mit seinem Vortrag über seine Reise in den Geist des Universums. Bitte schön.
Marcus, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and for the opportunity to address the time waiver community, which is certainly such a progressive and wonderful community. Martin mentioned Stanislav Grof. He's one of the co-founders with Abraham Maslow of transpersonal psychology, and he's the foremost authority of integrating LSD and other psychedelic substances into the therapeutic process. When I first read Realms of the Human Unconscious, his first book, I read it in 1979. I was a brand new, young, junior faculty member at the university. As soon as I read that book, I realized that psychedelics would represent a turning point, a pivot point, not only in psychology, but also in philosophy. And I was trained as a philosopher of religion. So I made the decision to begin a psychedelic voyage. I was convinced that the most important work which would be done in the near future would be done by people writing out of an experiential basis, not simply an intellectual basis. And so I began a process of doing that experiential work. Now, I have to assume a certain familiarity with Stan Grof's work. I won't try to describe the methodology of working with psychedelics. It's a very intense methodology. It's not tripping and going to a concert. It's working in very contemplative, isolated circumstances, isolated from the world, with eye shades going deeply within. I did this work over 20 years. Over 20 years, I did 73 high-dose LSD sessions using Stan Grof's paradigm. I worked for 4 years, and then I stopped for 6 years, which are not part of the story. And then I worked very intensely for another 10 years. Now, to do this work, I had to split my life in half. On the outside, I continued to be a university professor. I gave my lectures. I did the things that university professors do. In my inner life, I began this very intense journey, and I kept them separate. I kept a firewall between the two. I could not talk about my psychedelic work I talked with my friends at the university, but I never brought them into my classes. I never brought it to my students. It's only after I've retired from the university and after I'm past the statute of limitations for doing this work, because I stopped this work in 1999, that I'm able to really bring forward the philosophical work, the philosophical significance of these experiences. And this is what I'd like to share with you tonight. I am just finishing a book that I'm calling Diamonds from Heaven. I don't know whether this is what it will look like because it's still being considered by a publisher, but in my mind, this is how I've imagined it. Ervin Laszlo has contributed the foreword to the book. And what I would like to do is just basically take you through some of the highlights of this journey, just little touches, little scenarios here and there along the way. And I'd like to emphasize that I did this work as a philosopher, not as a therapist. I wasn't primarily seeking healing. I was seeking knowledge of how the universe works. I saw myself as pursuing a new philosophical method, a method that was pioneered by William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience. And this method consists of basically 3 steps, 3 stages. First, to structurally push the boundaries of your experience in carefully structured psychedelic sessions. Second, to come back and make a phenomenologically complete and accurate record of your experiences within 24 hours after every session. And third, to critically analyze your experience, to bring it into dialogue with other fields of knowledge, and to compare it with the experiences of other psychedelic explorers. So this is what happened. Now, this is only the 3rd time that I've tried to speak about these things in public, so you'll have to forgive me if I follow my notes maybe a little more closely than I might otherwise do. A few comments about method and then we'll go to the content. Oh, interesting. The spacing is different than on my computer. Most of you are aware of the difference between low-dose psycholytic therapy and high-dose psychedelic therapy. When I was doing this work, I saw myself doing basically an extended series of high-dose psychedelic therapy. The original protocol in Spring Grove Hospital restricted psychedelic sessions to a maximum of 3 sessions. What they were trying to do was to trigger a near-death type experience for people who were approaching their own physical death. And so I thought whatever could be done 3 times safely could be done more times safely. What I learned, however, was that while my work always stayed within the bounds of safety, working with multiple sessions with high doses of LSD opened up challenges and opportunities that weren't really considered in the first early stages of psychedelic therapy. And so looking back over the course of my work, I figured that I had to have a different name. I had to find a different name for it, so I call it psychedelic exploration. The method is the method of psychedelic therapy. Complete isolation, working with eye shades, with a sitter, always with a sitter, carefully calibrated music to pace the stages of the opening and closing of a session. The difference is the number of sessions involved. For me, 73 sessions over 20 years. I kept detailed records of all of my sessions. I even tracked the astrological variables of my sessions, looking at the correlations between transits and my session experiences. I kept meticulous notes over these years, about 400 pages of raw experiential data. And the story I'm telling in Diamonds from Heaven, and I call it Diamonds from Heaven, by the way, because I wanted to start at the end of the story. I thought, put the title that indicates where it ends, but it took a long time before the diamonds came in. It isn't really a personal story. I mean, it is a personal story, but it's not primarily a personal story. This diagram represents kind of a series of sessions, and they're drawn overlapping to emphasize that one session pretty much starts where the second session stopped. And I found that my personal experiences, the healing experiences and insights into my personal life, tended to take place at the beginning and the end of these sessions, when I was leaving and coming back into time and space. But when I was in the peak of the experiences, indicated by these large circles, after about the first 12 or 15 sessions, I was operating in a state of consciousness that was far beyond personal states of consciousness. And that's the story that I'm trying to tell in Diamonds from Heaven. That's the philosophically significant story, because that's, I think, the story that in some way we all share. It's all part of our collective inheritance. It's the cosmological story, which is the important story. When one does this work, one goes through many cycles, many iterations of death and rebirth, not just ego death. The first circle, this drop, everything below the cross line takes place below time and space reality. That bottom line kind of represents ego. And the first death rebirth cycle, which I've marked with the astrological glyphs, kind of in recognition of Richard Tarnas and Stan Groff's insights into the correlations between astrological transits and one's experiences in odd and ordinary states, which I only partly affirm. My experiences affirm and then don't confirm. But that first death rebirth takes place at what Stan calls the perinatal level of consciousness, and one moves into deeper states of consciousness. And then death and rebirth repeats itself in a deeper formulation, taking you into a deeper level of reality and a deeper level of reality. Stan Groff follows Ken Wilber in describing these levels in terms of psychic, subtle, causal level reality. I don't have any vested interest in what scale you use, and certainly to differentiate only 3 dimensions of consciousness. Transpersonal consciousness is elementary because there are thousands and thousands of dimensions of consciousness that one moves into. But basically, just to give a suggestion that there are many levels of consciousness and transpersonal consciousness, and one enters these levels of consciousness in stages, and at every stage there is a cost which is exacted. There is a depth of surrender that takes place. In the beginning, what's asked is for you to surrender your ego. But there are other types of surrender that take place at deeper levels of the journey. To draw only one circle is to oversimplify. Sometimes these indicate numbers of sessions, entering deeper and deeper into causal reality. There are cycles within cycles within cycles. So you can mark these all as one cycle, but in fact there were cycles within cycles within cycles as the journey continues. So the easiest way now is just to give you the chapters, to show you the chapters of the book, and maybe share a few comments on each of the chapters. So here are the chapters of Diamonds from Heaven. Crossing the perinatal plane, the ocean of suffering, deep time in the soul, initiation into the universe, the greater real of archetypal reality, a benediction of blessings, the birth of the future human, and diamond luminosity. Now there are some missing chapters. There's a methodology chapter, and there's a chapter where I give a typical, introduce to a typical session day, but these are the chapters that carry the content of the sessions, the content of the experiences. The first, crossing the perinatal plane, is the easiest to summarize because it's the one most people are most familiar with from reading Stan Grof's work. One goes through many fetal experiences, one relives one's experience in the womb, one relives one's own birth, one goes through many variations of the death and rebirth process. My going through this level took about 2 years and 10 sessions. And in the end, in the 9th and 10th session, the universe, in my version of ego death, it just snapped me like a twig. The ego is, in the end, not very difficult to take apart. It snapped me like a twig by turning me into the exact opposite of everything I had known myself to be. I entered the day as a white, middle-class, highly educated philosopher concerned with the meaning of existence. And it just took all of those variables and reversed them. I went in for hours and hours experiencing the lives of women and women of color from multiple cultures around the world, women who were poor, women who had no interest in philosophy whatsoever. And yet I was all of these things. I was all of these beings' lives. It was terribly frightening. It was just scared me to death. It was the perfect hell for a male philosopher. There's nothing wrong with being a woman, of course, and there's nothing wrong with being poor, and there's nothing wrong with being not interested in philosophy. The issue is, it was my identification with my maleness, my identification with my middle class, whatever, which was the problem, is what the universe had to break in me. And the message was not simply recover your lives as women, because I know I've had former lives as women. This was different. This was, where you're going, gender does not exist. Let go. So as part of my entry into deeper states of consciousness, my identity as a male was taken from me. And when I surrendered, and when it was taken from me, I entered into the most glorious experience of womanhood. I experienced hundreds and hundreds of women. I experienced all the aspects of female experiences that I could imagine. I conceived, I gave birth, I laughed at my husbands. I wish every man could have the experience of having such a deep experience of women's lives. When I went into the next phase, the next 2 years of work, I entered a domain of extraordinary collective suffering. I entered systematically deeper and deeper and deeper. I was taken into just an orgy of pain and suffering. It seemed to comprise all the wars of history, all the droughts, all the famines. It was just, it was a true ordeal. In the beginning, I thought that this represented a deepening of ego death. I thought that somehow pieces of my ego had slipped through the first death, and this was somehow this collective suffering represented a deepening of ego death. But eventually, this went on for so long, and it involved so many thousands and hundreds of thousands of beings, that I came to a different conclusion. The conclusion I came to was that somehow these sessions were something was using my sessions not to heal my private person. It wasn't about healing my private life. It was about trying to heal the collective psyche of the human race. That somehow all the trauma of all those wars and all that violence through history has lodged itself into the collective psyche. And at least in this particular context, one of the ways that the universe was trying to heal the human species was in these expanded states of consciousness, beginning to siphon and draw out of it through this awareness the pain of the human species and transform that pain and bring it into the light. Now, psychedelic sessions have two halves. There is the first half, which is the cleansing half, where I was experiencing this ocean of suffering, and then there's the second half. You go through a certain amount of work, and the suffering comes to a culmination, and after that, the rest of the session, you're spun into positive, ecstatic, transpersonal spaces. The ocean of suffering lasted 2 years, but actually there was 1 year of work. Then I took a 6-year break, and then I started another 10 years of work. And the ocean of suffering, when I resumed my work 6 years later, started exactly where it had stopped 6 years before, which I think is an indication of the precision and the intentionality of the intelligence that we are engaging in these deep states of consciousness. When I came through the ocean of suffering in the first half, the first year, I entered into what I call deep time in the soul. I had a series of experiences in which I experienced my entire life from beginning to end complete. I experienced the distilled essence of everything that I was in the process of becoming and everything that I had become. It was my entire life complete, start to finish. And I kept coming back to it again and again and again, the same system field, opening up layers, more and more layers. I began to have insights into the people I was related to my wife, to the family members. The first time I entered this state, when I came out of it, I couldn't remember any of it. It was the most meaningful experience of my life, but I couldn't remember it. When I went back into it a second and a third and a fourth time, however, I began to remember more and more. I could hold on to more and more of the experiences. And this is an important epistemological point. When you enter these states of consciousness, you, in the beginning, will enter into new states of consciousness which are so cognitively original, you can't hold on to it. And this is where I think people talk about ineffability. But if you keep going back to the same state of consciousness again and again and again, you will remember more and more. You literally have to teach yourself how to stay conscious in these deep states of consciousness. And you can teach yourself to stay conscious in these deep states of consciousness. It involves tremendous purification. You go through one level of purification after another, but you can go through and remain conscious. 6 years later, when I entered my work again and the ocean of suffering resumed, that time when I went into the ecstatic portion of the experiences, it started in a completely different space with no explanation. I entered into what I call the initiation into the universe, a series of sessions that took me deeper and deeper into the universe and gave me a carefully calibrated series of instructions. It was like going to course, except in this case the professor was the universe itself. Now, I give my sessions names to help me remember them. When I try to give them a name that represents the pith of each session, and I break my sessions down into bullet points. I'm trying to remember the entire session and the entire journey. And so these are the names of the sessions that I'm addressing in Initiation into the Universe. Oh, sorry, Final Visions, forgot that one. Okay. All right. Initiation into the Universe. You and I creating, so it's taken back into the original point of creation, the cosmic tour. Some of these are represented, if you've heard these names before, they're in Dark Night, Early Dawn. the Council of Elders. Dying into oneness was a session of repeatedly dying deeper and deeper and deeper into oneness. The master plan was the first of a series of visions that took place over many years in which I was being shown what the universe's agenda was for the human race. I know it sounds arrogant. It sounds like ego run amok to say that. But in my experience, what I was being shown was what the evolutionary trajectory was of humanity and what the evolutionary agenda was for humanity. Eventually, the ocean of suffering reached a level of intensity it's hard to describe. It culminated in what I call healing the collective wound, just a massive, huge purification process of collective healing. And when that finished, it spun me into an unprecedented, a new level of reality, a level of reality that I call archetypal reality, the greater real of archetypal reality. When I first entered archetypal reality, my identity as a human being began to fall away from me. I found that there is an identity that we have as a human being that is deeper than the identity we have as a specific human being. And to enter into archetypal reality, I literally had to leave behind the entire history of human race, and not just my personal history, but I had to leave behind the conditions of human consciousness. It imaged like being in the space station orbiting above the Earth. I entered a state of consciousness that was beyond the collective psyche, and I was being worked with for months, being taught how to experience, how reality works at that level beyond the collective psyche. In my experience, there were two levels of reality that I experienced at that archetypal level, one of them at the high subtle level, one of them at the low subtle level. At the high subtle level, which I think of as kind of the Platonic level, I encountered living forms that were responsible for creating space-time and the core structures of space-time. They were vast, they were huge. My mind imaged them like galaxies, billions of light years across. They were just enormous. I could not wrap my mind around them. They were archetypes, but they were not like Plato's archetypes. They were not eternal ideas in the mind of an unchanging God. They were living forms that were changing, but over vast tracts of time. Subsequently, I went into lower subtle level reality, which is more of a Jungian kind of level. I entered into the living tissue of the collective psyche. I had many experiences over and over again of the wholeness that the human psyche represents, that it is. Even the human body, I had experiences of the archetype of the body, that all of us are fractal manifestations of, aspects of. And I experienced how each of us in healing our individual diseases is contributing to the archetypal structure of our human body as it becomes stronger and stronger through history. I began to have experiences of reincarnation, but as a collective process. I had always imaged reincarnation as an individual process where we individually are developing our soul's journey. But I began to have experiences of the human race as a single organism, incarnating intelligently, creatively, intentionally, generation by generation. I was working in deep time, experiencing the pulse of humanity's self-evolution through incarnation of billions and billions of beings every century, just moving. It was both simultaneously a numinous experience and an absolutely devastating experience at the same time. To experience all of humanity with all the experiences that all of us are going through in every generation, to experience that from the perspective of the unified intelligence that was manifesting as the species and evolving the species farther and farther through time. It gave me a completely expanded horizon of the intelligence of the universe. After spending 18 months exploring archetypal reality, which is not long, and I went through it with very big steps, so what my description is very incomplete of the totality of that reality, I entered a year of extraordinary blessings. I called it the benediction of blessings. It was one blessing after another for an entire year. These are the names of the sessions. Oh, I've got to keep up with my notes a little bit more. These are the sessions I dealt with in archetypal reality. Let me jump back there for just a second. Notice how much cleansing is involved even when you're working at such a deep level of consciousness. Session 28 was an extraordinarily positive blessing. It was my first contact with causal reality. I touched this extraordinarily beautiful, ecstatic state of consciousness. I was only there for 30 minutes. But the next 3 sessions over 6 months were just grueling ordeals of detoxification and purification. What I came to understand is each deeper state of consciousness is a higher level of energy. And when you enter a deeper state of consciousness, you have to acclimate to that higher level of energy. Otherwise, your experiences there will be fragmented. You'll be chaotically confused. And so just that one touch of causal reality, it took 3 sessions, hours and hours of physical, psychological detoxification in order for me to be able to return to that state of consciousness so I could return to it more clearly, so I could stay more cognitively coherent in that state. This is a pattern that repeats itself over and over and over again as you go deeper and deeper into the universe. So much so that I began to dread the session after every major breakthrough. There was a carrying out the garbage quality. Every time I broke through into a new luminous state of consciousness, the next sessions were just terribly difficult. Now I can go into the benediction of blessings. I present 4 sessions in the book. Each of these was different. The forest was an experience of oneness, shunyata, emptiness. It was like no self present in me, no self present in the world. It's an absolute transparency to the totality of life as a living singularity. It was a deep entry into causal reality. Singing the universe away, jumping over, singing the universe away was an entering into the primal void. It was an entering into the Buddha womb, Satchitananda. It was the primal fertile void that underlies all manifest existence. Jesus' blood was an experience of, overwhelming experience of cosmic love. It's just being drenched in, you've never been loved until you've been loved like God. You know, it's just overwhelming experience of love, deeper than anything I'd ever experienced before. Let me mention the birth of the diamond soul just a little bit longer because it'll come up again later in the sessions. 11 years previous, I had had the experience of my life as a completed whole, start to finish. But in the 40th session, I began to experience the integration of all my former lives. They were coming in, it was like winding a string and around a kite spool. All my former lives were coming in fast and furious. And it was like winding a string of white light on a kite spool. And when it hit a certain critical mass, it exploded. All those individual lives fused into one life, and they exploded. It was my first contact with what I would call diamond luminosity. My heart just ruptured and exploded. My consciousness jumped far beyond any consciousness of any individual life. And I think what I experienced at that day was where reincarnation is taking humanity. Reincarnation is not adding a little bit lifetime by lifetime, adding a few more qualities, a few more capacities, lifetime by lifetime. Reincarnation is taking us into, I think, eventually, taking us into a point where all of our former lives, all of our history, all of our learning will fuse. And when it fuses, it lifts us into the next step in human evolution. The soul literally will wake up on earth. Because I think reincarnation, we die, our mind gets large, we are born, we contract to a small consciousness. We go from the soul to the ego, the soul to the ego. But if we keep this up for thousands of years, sooner or later, the soul is going to wake up on earth. And when that happens, everything changes. Because the soul experiences life differently than the ego does. The soul experiences a depth of connection with other beings because we've been in each other's lives for centuries and centuries. The soul has a different relationship to the earth because the soul knows that the earth that it leaves will be the earth it's going to inherit in its next incarnation. So it has a whole different relationship to the issues of ecology and caretaking of the earth. Where the sessions went next chronologically was into the diamond luminosity work. But before I go into that, I need to backtrack a little bit and talk about the birth of the future human. When I started this work, I never imagined that what I'm about to describe to you would become part of it. I was thinking that I was doing this work for my personal healing, for my personal transformation, my personal enlightenment, whatever. But what happened was I started in the 23rd session, and in multiple sessions over the course of the years, I started to have repeated visions of the human race, what was happening to the human race. And I think this is a natural progression, because when you die as an individual, when you die as an ego, and your consciousness opens, it doesn't just open into the oneness of God, it opens up into the species that you are, into the life of the species. And just like we have a feeling of our individual age, you enter into the age of your species. And I was repeatedly shown that the human species is coming into a time of a tremendous exponential explosion in its capacity. We were coming into a time of great awakening. So in this chapter, I present what are 6 visions that I call the visions of awakening, visions that I pull out of all these other sessions that I've already presented, and I just kind of weave them together to show the coherent story, the story of this great awakening, the story of this birth that we are coming into. And I had seen over 4 years this story, but it never showed me how it was going to pull it off. I never saw how we were going to make this jump in consciousness. And then in 1995, a week before Christmas, I was expecting to go, I was in the diamond luminosity work. I was expecting to go one more time into the diamond luminosity state. But instead, the universe threw me far into deep time, far into humanity's future, and it gave me the experience of the death and rebirth of our species at a collective level. There was nothing personal about my experience. I was the human species. I was the psyche of the planet as a whole. I had dissolved into this collective psyche, and I experienced a death that took place at that level. It was a near-death experience, but for the species. There was a time we were overtaken by conditions. There was a loss of control. It was a loss of a deconstruction. It was a time of great suffering. I think the 21st century is going to be the beginning of the dark night of our collective soul. It is going to be the time of the great undoing. We're going to lose control. We've postponed making the important environmental, ecological, cultural decisions so many times that I think there's no avoiding the fact that we are coming to a time of a great global systems crisis. And just when it had reached its worst, just when it was at its worst, it passed. The storm passed, like a hurricane going over an island. And when we began to collect ourselves, to pick ourselves off of the ground, there was an exponential growth of light within the human species, an exponential growth in intelligence, in ideas, in creativity, in social formulations, in social formats. New families were springing up. I think that this process that we are going through is leading us not simply to recreate our culture and recreate society and to create a new technology and a new economy. It's literally a transformation that is taking place at the core of the collective psyche. Our collective psyche is going to make a shift into a new foundation. And after that point, everyone born a human being is going to be operating out of a new foundation. I think we truly are becoming a species of Buddhas, a species of Christ and prophets. After the benediction of blessings, I was completely content. I mean, the universe had asked me to give something in the ocean of suffering, and I gave it. And it rewarded me with more joy than I could ever imagine. It was just an overwhelming joy. I had known God. I had known the fertile void. It was a philosopher's dream come true. I had no idea where things would go. But there were still 5 years ahead on the journey. And where it went, it took me into, after one more death and rebirth cycle, it took me into an extraordinarily hyper-clear state of consciousness. It took me into the light that I came to call diamond luminosity. It's what the Buddhists call a dharmakaya, the absolute clear light of being. Now, I had known light many times before. Light comes in, light had come in at the subtle level of consciousness, light had come in many different dimensions, but this is a different order of light. When I call it the diamond light, I'm not simply using a metaphor to describe the light. I'm trying to describe a particular quality of light, an ultra-clear, super-luminescent, just clear beyond imagination. I entered the diamond luminosity 4 times in the next 4 years. Out of 25 sessions, only 4 times did I enter the diamond luminosity. These are the names that I gave these sessions. In between each entry into the diamond luminosity, as you can imagine, tremendous purification, tremendous detoxification, healing the system, but then I would get spun into another experience of this diamond light. There were 2 movements in this process. There was a progressive entering deeper and deeper into the diamond luminosity, and the 50th session was the deepest I ever went into the diamond luminosity. I was in a state of deep absorption into pure light. I was light. My boundaries were lost entirely. I was as happy as you can imagine a person being. And just at that moment, something happened that changed my entire understanding of life. My visual field pivoted 90 degrees, and in the far distance, I saw a reality that was as far beyond where I was as where I was in the diamond light was beyond Earth, time, space. And in that reality, I saw light, and I was hit by a ray of light from that reality. It hit me, and it just shattered me. I call it the absolute light, just to give it a name. And that's when I understood that it's an infinite progression. There is no end to the journey. There is no reaching the end of God, the end of the divine. Like many of us, I had adopted the belief that there was an end to this journey. It had been described differently by different people. Oneness with God, or the supercosmic void, entering the supercosmic void. But I had entered the divine oneness many times, and I had learned that there were dimensions of oneness. There are different variations within. There are depths of to oneness. And I had entered the primal void, but I learned that there are even depths of void within void. But I had always assumed that there was still an end. I could get to an end that would be the destiny, the final or stopping point. And this taught me it's an infinite progression. There is no stopping point. The divine is infinitely large. And that's why, if I were doing it over again, I wouldn't use the same method that I'd used before. I would be gentler with myself. I would not push myself so hard to enter so deep, so fast, even though 20 years may not be very fast. I would be gentler with myself, because now I know that the goal of this work is not to try to reach some state, some condition. The goal of this work is to open up and to let in as much of the divine into you as you possibly can, and to allow it to transform your life and to transform your existence and everything that you can do with that awareness in life. The last year's work is Final Visions. These are the sessions that I address in the book. The last two visions, the last two sessions were what I call the goodbye sessions. I didn't know I was stopping this work. I thought I was going to continue to do it, but the consciousness that had always guided my sessions, it choreographed the ending of our time together before I knew what was happening. It gave me an overview of my entire life's work. It showed me, in the end, in this fruits of my labor, how all of my work fit together, what the correlations were, and I used the experiences in that session to actually organize the telling of the story in Diamonds from Heaven. And then it gave me a series of last instructions before we parted. But before that happened, there was one serious piece of work to do. Chapter 7, session 70. On that session, the universe put me through a strip down, which was one of the hardest, one of the deepest, most demanding strip downs that I'd ever been anywhere on the journey. I would not have believed it would have been possible to go through so many layers of dying and death and just complete loss of all reality as I went through in this session. And after going through this for an hour and a half or 2 hours, that spun me out into a condition, a very clear state of consciousness. And to make a long story short, since I'm already at the end of my time, I'm past time, I'm sorry. It took me deeper into deep time than it had ever taken me before. It took me deep, deep into a time frame somewhere on the order of 100, 200,000 years. And it gave me a series of experiences that were the culmination of the birth of the future human. It gave me the capstone of the story of the master story of where we're going. It gave me the deepest experience that I had of the being that we are becoming. It was as if I was taken into the future and allowed to try on for size the being that the creative intelligence of the universe is bringing forward on our planet. Such a magnificent being, just an extraordinary being. It's so important that we hold a vision of where we're going, of what is actually happening, because as the dark shadows gather in this century and the century ahead, we could lose ourselves in despair. We could lose ourselves in hopelessness if we don't understand that we are in labor. We are in labor, and we are giving birth. And we're not simply giving birth to a slightly improved version of ourselves. We are giving birth to an extraordinary child, a child that has never existed as a species on this planet before. One of the other things this experience it taught me was, it gave me a series of lessons, and it taught me something that was a missing piece to everything that I had been given before about the birth of the future human. It showed me that we are built for speed. Our species is built for speed. We have a tendency to think of human nature, kind of as a static thing, human nature this, human nature that. But really, if you step back into an expanded time frame, and if you think in terms of reincarnation, you think in terms of all the lives that we are winding around, and then this gathering of knowledge which is taking place in the center, in the archetypal center, When this center shifts, there is an exponential jump. And when you look at the whole evolutionary dynamic, that evolution, that reincarnation makes possible, it becomes clear that we are carrying our history on our backs in much smaller packs than we might think if we didn't take this large perspective. We are built for speed. The human species is built for speed. We are built for evolutionary acceleration. And we are in a tremendously accelerated time of history right now. And before any of us were born, before we were born, we knew what we were getting into. We knew, we chose, we knew what was happening to the human race. We knew what a hard time this century was going to be. And we made a choice to participate in this time in history, to be part of this exciting and dynamic, if difficult, but this important progression. Now, I'm done, my time is done. I can't go on further. I will just very quickly say, when I stopped my sessions for two reasons. For pain, because my subtle energy system was overexcited, I was running too much energy, even though I took a lot of yoga, did meditation, did all the things you try to do to take care of yourself. But the main reason I stopped was heartache. I literally reached a point where I could not take coming back. I could not take coming back out of the divine. Once you have dissolved completely into light, once you have known the joy of being light, of experiencing reality as light, time-space reality can begin to feel kind of dried up. And in fact, when I stopped my sessions, I entered a period of deep, deep sadness. I did a good job integrating my sessions as I went. I really worked hard on integrating my sessions. But when I stopped my sessions, I entered a deep, deep existential sadness. And I know that near-death episode people have this experience. I knew that Carl Jung had this experience in the hospital. I knew I was not alone in this. But I had entered so deeply into the divine expanse that my wound was particularly deep. Eventually, I reached a point where I knew I was just waiting to die. I was just waiting. I was taking care of my family. I was doing my lectures. I was taking care of my responsibilities. But in my heart of hearts, I was just waiting to die so that I could return to my beloved. Eventually, I began to realize that's not right. This is not a good way to live. It's not the way this work is supposed to go. It's not good to be living your life waiting to die. So I made a determined effort to bring myself into my historical existence again, to ground myself into time and space. I learned that somewhere along the way, I made a mistake. The mistake I made was that I had lost the balance between transcendence and immanence. I had thrown myself so deeply into divine transcendence that I lost my footing inside the immanent divine, inside the body of God, inside the physical presence of God that we all are. It took me about 10 years to get myself fully grounded back in time and space and fully kind of comfortable back in time and space again. And in this respect, my experience on this journey is a cautionary tale. It's not simply like, the hero's journey where you go and you have an adventure and you bring back with good news. It's a cautionary tale. Transcendence is a complicated, paradoxical thing. A little bit of transcendence is good. It's healing. It can help us understand who we are and what we are and where we are and what here is. But too much transcendence can cause you to lose sight of an equally important fact, the fact that the physical world is the manifest body of the divine. So, thank you very much for letting me tell my story to you.